I always thought that nothing in the world could surprise me after so many years of living, working, raising a family, facing losses and celebrating victories. But that night, that one night, I discovered that life always has room for one more wound, one more shock, one more change that you never imagined facing. I was in the living room, comfortably seated in my old leather armchair, the one my wife said seemed to have been molded for my body, when I heard a voice coming from the hallway. It was low but clear enough to pierce the silence of that house which, for so many years, had been synonymous with peace. At first I thought it was the television in my daughter's room. Then I realized it was her voice, on the phone. At first I didn't think much of it. It was normal for her to talk to friends, co-workers, sometimes even her boyfriend. But then, between one sentence and another, something in her tone changed. A coldness, a detachment, something calculated. My attention was drawn, without me realizing it. I leaned forward, as if instinct itself was pulling me to listen better. And that's when I heard, clearly, without room for doubt, "He won't last long." For a second I thought I'd misunderstood, but my mind repeated those words like a cruel echo hammering inside my head. "He won't last long." She said that. My daughter, the girl I held in my arms, whom I took to school, whom I defended from any shadow that threatened her happiness. She said that you wouldn't it last long? Who else would she be talking about? I froze completely. I couldn't even breathe properly. It was as if my heart had stopped for a moment, trying to process it all. I felt a deep shock, a pang of betrayal that shot through my chest as if someone had ripped the ground out from under my feet. My daughter, the person who should care most about my well-being, was saying this with frightening nonchalance. My gaze was fixed on the hallway door, but my thoughts were far away, completely jumbled. Who was on the other end of that line? Why did she say that? Was it about me? About someone else? Why that tone, that coldness, that calculated pause before the sentence? Every detail seemed like a piece of a puzzle that I didn't know if I was ready to put together. As she continued speaking, disconnected words that made no sense in isolation, the phrase kept repeating in my mind as if it were recorded on a scratched record. He won't last long. Shock turned into anxiety. Anxiety turned into fear. And fear opened the door to suspicions I had never allowed into my life. I started thinking about the weather, my health, my possessions, my family's future. Was it possible she was waiting for something to happen to me? That she was talking about my life like someone commenting on the weather forecast? I wished more than anything that it was just a misunderstanding, but something inside me, a voice I had always ignored, insisted that something was wrong. Something very wrong. The room, once so cozy, felt cramped, suffocating. Every object around me, the pictures on the wall, the lamp beside the armchair, the clock my wife gave me on our 20th anniversary, all seemed like silent observers of that painful revelation. I stood up slowly, without making a sound, trying at the same time not to draw attention and to control the wave of emotions that threatened to overflow. I didn't have the courage to approach the hallway. Not at that moment. I wanted to hear more, but I also feared discovering something I wasn't ready to face. My chest felt heavy. My breath was short. I felt my hand trembling. It was one of those seconds in life when everything seems to slip out of control. And it was in that instant, standing there in the middle of the room, that I realized something that would change everything. It didn't matter who was on the other end of the line, nor what the context was. The sentence had been spoken. The coldness was there, and the doubt, that cruel doubt, had already settled. Inside me like a silent poison. That night, even before knowing the whole truth, I was no longer the same. That sentence, just 3 simple words, had broken something inside me, something that might never be the same again. And no matter how hard I tried to push the thought away, one certainty stayed with me until I closed my eyes that morning. If she really was talking about me, my own daughter, then something very serious was happening, and I needed to act. That phrase not only hurt me, it would become the trigger for everything that followed. My name may not matter so much to those listening to this story, but my journey, that truly embodies every piece of who I am. I am a man past 60, with wrinkles that came not only from time, but from responsibilities, sleepless nights, silent efforts that no one sees, and sacrifices that only a father knows how to make without expecting recognition. I was born into a simple family, the kind that learns early on that nothing falls from the sky. I grew up hearing that life doesn't forgive the lazy, and that those who don't fight for their dreams end up living in the dreams of others. I worked hard from a very young age. I worked in construction, unloaded trucks, did odd jobs in all sorts of fields, until I managed to open my own small business. It wasn't luck, it was sweat. Every penny I've earned has a story, every achievement leaves a mark, and if there's one thing that has always guided me, it's the deep desire to give my children a better life than I had. And I gave. At least, I tried. I worked until my body begged for rest. I gave up vacations, free nights, hobbies. If my children needed money for school, for the doctor, for a course, for a dream, I found a way. How many times did I go to sleep with a heavy head thinking about the bills, but still get up the next day with the strength that only a father's love offers? Many more than I can count. I'm the kind of man who believes in respect, gratitude, and family. One of those who thinks sitting down at the table on Sunday is sacred, who values his word, who would rather lose money than lose his dignity. And I say this not to boast, but to explain who I am before judging my choices, including the most difficult choice I made the night I heard the phrase that changed everything. My children grew up seeing a present, albeit tired, father. They saw hard work. They saw struggle. They saw overcoming challenges. And, at least in my mind, this should have instilled in them the same sense of responsibility, affection, and respect. I always believed that all that effort created eternal bonds. I always thought that the love between a father and son was a two-way street, even if sometimes crooked. But life has a strange way of testing our certainties. Today, as I introduce myself to you, I am not just an older man. I am someone who carries emotional scars that no one sees. Someone who spent decades putting family first and now wonders if it was all really worth it. You know that feeling of having done everything right, but still feeling like something was lost along the way? Well, that feeling has been my constant companion, and I'm not saying this to sound like a victim. On the contrary, my life has been built on courage, difficult choices, and decisions that required guts. And even so, I confess, on that night, when I heard my daughter say, "He won't last long," I felt small, vulnerable, as if that strong, protective, hard-working man had suddenly become disposable. The weight of this cannot be put into words. We spend our whole lives believing that starting a family is synonymous with emotional security. But the truth is that sometimes dangers come from where we least expect them. I also need you to understand something else about me. I'm not a perfect man. I've made many mistakes too. I was too strict at times, absent at others, and perhaps I confused providing with being present. But there was always love. That was never lacking. And perhaps that's exactly why the phrase I heard that night hurt so much, because it came from someone I held in my arms, someone I saw take their first steps, someone I taught to ride a bike, someone I helped heal scraped knees and broken hearts. I always did everything for my children. Everything, really. And perhaps that's why I developed a kind of moral authority that accompanies me to this day. An inner voice that tells me that, for what I've lived through and what I've given, I deserve at least respect. I deserve at least honesty. I deserve not to be treated as someone who won't last long. This is me, a man who built his fortune brick by brick, not to show off, but to ensure that his children would never have to face the difficulties I faced. A man who believes in the strength of family, but who that night found himself facing an emotional abyss he never imagined he would know. And as I tell this story, I know that many who are listening may recognize a piece of themselves here. Perhaps you too have given everything for someone and yet felt that it wasn't enough. Perhaps you too have been surprised by a phrase, a look, a gesture that cut deeper than any knife. Perhaps you too have discovered that, however strong a father may be, there is a kind of pain that can pierce any armor. I'm sharing this not just to introduce myself, but so you understand where every decision I make from now on comes from. Because when a man like me, tired, experienced, full of scars, but also full of love, hears something like, he won't last long, the impact is devastating, and the attitudes that follow, those carry the full weight of the life I've built, the emotions I've fought to hide, and the vulnerability that has finally come to the surface. This is me, a father, a worker, a survivor, and that night, for the first time in many years, I felt fear. Fear of the truth, fear of the future, fear of what might be about to happen within my own family. My relationship with my daughter has always been special. I don't know if it's a father-daughter thing, but from the day I held her in my arms for the first time, I felt something different, something I hadn't even felt with myself throughout my life. She was small, fragile, but at the same time she carried a strength in her gaze that disarmed me. They say that when a daughter is born, the father's heart is divided. Half continues beating in his chest, and the other half begins to beat inside her. And perhaps that's why everything that has happened in the last few months has affected me so deeply, because deep down, when she started to change, it was as if a part of me was also being lost. I always spoiled her, always. If she asked for a toy, I'd find a way. If she needed money for college, I'd work overtime, stay up all night, tighten my belt, but I'd deliver it the next day. If she cried because of some relationship problem, I was there, always with that slightly awkward but loving hug. My wife used to say I was raising a modern princess, independent, strong, but knowing that if she needed it, she'd have an entire castle to support her. And it was true. I would do anything for her. I remember every detail of her childhood, the crooked drawings she proudly handed me, the school festivals where she danced shyly and sought my gaze in the audience, the silly conversations in the car on the way home from school. I always thought these memories would be the foundation of an eternal connection, something so solid that no wind of life could shake it. But as I later discovered, sometimes what we think is strong is precisely what is deteriorating the most without us realizing it. In recent months, something changed about her. It wasn't overnight. It was subtle, silent, almost imperceptible, like a crack that starts out too thin to be noticed. First came the short answers, then the hurried conversations. That sparkle in her eyes when we talked about her day became dull, distant. She no longer sat down to watch TV with me. She no longer talked about work, friends, plans. Little by little, I realized that there was always a place in her mind that I could no longer reach. And then came the calls. Lots of calls. She began spending hours on the phone, sometimes in her room, sometimes on the balcony, sometimes in the car before even getting home. She spoke softly, almost whispering. Sometimes she laughed, but that laugh had none of the lightness I knew. It was a restrained laugh, almost uncomfortable. Other times she spoke seriously, with that cold tone that makes any father feel like he's lost a piece of his heart. At first, I thought it was just work, maybe a personal problem she didn't want to share. After all, adults keep secrets too. But as the days went by, the distance grew. The coldness intensified. The feeling that something was being hidden grew stronger. And I can say that there's a kind of instinct that only a father knows, an inner voice, that warns even before there's any proof. I still tried to get closer. I'd invite them to dinner, suggest watching an old movie, ask how things were going, but I always got the same kind of answer. Later, Dad. Not now. I am busy, and if there's one thing a loving father notices, it's when he ceases to be a priority, not out of malice, but because of change. And her change was starting to weigh on us at home, but especially on me. The first warning sign, the one that truly opened my eyes, was a conversation I overheard a few weeks before the night that would change everything. She was in the kitchen, talking on the phone, and said something like, "Not now, he'll notice." And then he fell silent as soon as he saw me. I remember her look at that moment. It wasn't fear, it wasn't guilt. It was discomfort. As if I were entering territory that was no longer mine. As if something was being carefully hidden from me. It was then that I began to realize that something much bigger was happening. something she didn't trust or didn't want me to know. Still, I believed it was just a phase. After all, children grow up, create their own lives, and drift away a little. But what bothered me most wasn't the distance. It was the mystery. The way she always seemed to be involved in something I couldn't reach. The way the calls became more and more frequent, longer and longer, more and more intense. I tried hard not to think bad things. I told myself she was dealing with something personal, maybe a complicated relationship, maybe problems at work, maybe internal doubts. We want to believe in the best when it comes to those we love. It's almost an emotional obligation. We cling to the idea that everything will pass, that love is enough, that things will go back to normal. But deep down, a part of me, that tired, experienced, and realistic part, whispered that her distance wasn't simple. It was calculated. It was intentional. And when a daughter who was once affectionate, sweet, and smiling starts acting like this, a father's heart aches. It aches in a way that defies explanation, because you realize you're losing access to a place where there was once trust. And losing that access is like losing a piece of your own soul. It was this series of small changes, these silent cracks, that prepared the ground for the bigger shock. When I heard that phrase, "He won't last long," everything made sense in a cruel way. All the connections, all the averted glances, all the coldness, all the emotional distance. The phrase didn't come out of nowhere. It was part of something that had been growing for months, something I didn't want to see at first, but which was now gaining weight, form, and threat. And in that instant, I realized that the first warning sign wasn't the phrase itself, but the months of silence, mystery, and muffled phone calls that preceded it. The phrase only confirmed everything my heart already feared. I never really believed in those stories of destiny, coincidences planned by the universe, or signs that appear at the exact moment. I've always been more pragmatic. Things happen because they happen, because choices were made, because paths cross by chance. But that afternoon, that specific afternoon, I began to doubt my own logic. If I hadn't left work early, if I hadn't forgotten that folder at home, if I had decided to stop at the market first, maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe I would still be living in the same comfortable ignorance that had accompanied me for so many years. But life didn't want it that way. I arrived home about 2 hours earlier than usual. The sun was still strong, illuminating the front garden with a golden light that should have been soothing, but which that day carried something strange, almost unsettling. I carefully opened the gate, as I always did, and noticed that the front door was only slightly ajar. I found it curious, because my daughter has always been careful about that. Since she was little, she had this habit of double-checking if the door was locked. It was strange to see it there, half open, as if someone had passed by distractedly. I pushed the door open slowly, and before I was even fully inside, I heard her voice. It was as if time had stopped. The house was silent, except for the restrained, low, but intense voices coming from the hallway. She didn't notice my arrival. Perhaps she was so engrossed in that conversation that the world around her simply ceased to exist. And I stood there, frozen on the edge between the living room and the entrance, too afraid to take the next step. "No, you don't understand. He won't last long." The phrase came without hesitation, without trembling, without doubt. The tone, that tone. It tore me apart inside. It wasn't a concern. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't pain. It was calculation, coldness, a kind of certainty that sent a shiver down my spine, as if my body were trying to warn me even before my mind had processed what I'd heard. Her voice was firm, almost harsh. It wasn't the tone of someone discussing a possibility. It was the tone of someone who already knew the outcome, as if she were planning something, as if that "it won't last long" was part of a larger, darker, more dangerous conversation. My heart pounded so hard that for a second I thought she could hear it. I held my breath, not on purpose, but because my body reacted on its own, as if it needed to hide. Part of me wanted to run into the hallway and ask right then and there, "What did you mean by that? Who are you talking about?" But another part, a much more instinctive and frightened part, held back my steps. I wasn't ready. I wasn't prepared for what I might discover. The most disturbing thing wasn't the phrase. It was the rhythm that is. Each word came out measured, controlled, without haste, without emotion, as if reporting an inevitable fact. A slight, almost calculated pause. Won't last long. It could be. About anyone. It could be a colleague, a patient, a friend, a boyfriend, I don't know. But in that context, in that coldness, in that sequence of strange weeks and whispered conversations, it was impossible not to think that the he in the sentence was me. And that thought, even if still just a suspicion, hit me like a punch in the gut. My position allowed me to see only her shadow reflected on the floor. She gestured with her free hand while holding her cell phone in the other. Her posture was rigid, tense, as if she were dealing with something urgent, something that demanded precision. I couldn't hear the other person on the line, but the silence between her words spoke volumes. It seemed as if the conversation had been going on for some time. I've already said, there's no point in pressuring it. It will happen naturally. Another pause. Yes, I know what I'm doing. Those phrases, each one seemed to push a knife a little deeper inside me. With each word, my mind created dozens of hypotheses, and all of them were terrible. The biggest question that echoed inside me wasn't just, who is she talking about, but who is she talking to? The idea that my daughter was discussing, planning, talking about something so serious with someone I didn't even know created a suffocating suspense. It was like standing before a closed door, knowing that behind it lies a truth capable of changing everything, but without the courage to turn the doorknob. My hands were sweating. My chest ached. And the more I listened, the more I felt a mixture of anger, fear, and disbelief. I wanted to believe my interpretation was wrong, that it was all a misunderstanding. But her tone, that frozen tone, shattered any hope I was trying to hold on to. The feeling of not knowing who she was talking to only made everything worse. It could be a partner. It could be someone manipulating her. It could be someone taking advantage of her vulnerability. Or, what scared me the most, it could be some kind of self-serving conversation. Something to do with money, possessions, the future, with my future. I approached slowly, almost dragging my feet. The hallway door was ajar, letting out a sliver of light that cut across the living room floor. The closer I got, the more I felt my whole body freeze, as if every part of me was trying to decide whether it was better to listen or run away. And then, out of nowhere, silence. A silence so sudden it seemed to warn that something had changed. Perhaps she had. Noticed my presence? Perhaps I had ended the call? Perhaps I had heard the creak of the wooden floorboards beneath my foot? I stood motionless as if frozen in time. The air felt trapped in my throat, and that's when I realized nothing in my life would ever be the same after that moment. That phrase, that intonation, that conversation, it was like a door opening onto a mystery I never imagined I'd face within my own home. And the worst part of all? I didn't know yet that this was just the beginning. When you hear a phrase on the street, it goes in one ear and out the other. But when you hear certain words inside your own home, spoken by someone you helped raise, they don't simply pass by. They settle in. They take root in your mind and begin to grow, spread, distort everything around them like a poisonous vine. That's exactly what happened to me after I heard my daughter say, with that calculated coldness, "He won't last long." At that moment, I wasn't absolutely sure she was talking about me. But to tell the truth, the doubt hurt just as much as if I were certain. I went back into the room in silence, trying to feign normalcy, sitting down again in the armchair as if I could pick up my life where I had left off. But I couldn't anymore. The house was the same, the furniture was the same, the sound of the clock on the wall was the same. But I was no longer the same man. The first thing that came to mind was the anger a hot, intense rage rose like fire through my chest. After everything I've done, is this how she talks about me? I thought about every extra hour, every sleepless night, every sacrifice I made to secure her future. I thought about the times I defended my daughter, even from her own family, when they said I spoiled her too much. And now, to hear that cold, harsh phrase, it was as if someone had spat on everything I had built. But right after the anger came the fear, and this one was even worse. Because anger, you can at least channel. It's somewhere. You yell, complain, take it out on something, argue. But fear spreads silently. I started thinking about my age, my health, my last few doctor's visits, a delayed exam, a pain I'd been ignoring, a medication the doctor had prescribed more diligently. Did she know something I didn't? Had she spoken to a doctor? Was she telling someone something I didn't even understand yet? At that moment, a phrase flashed through my mind with frightening clarity. She's waiting for me to die. I didn't want to believe it. It was too cruel, too heavy to be true. But the more I tried to push the thought away, the more it came back. I would look at the hallway door and almost imagine my daughter on the other side, on the phone, explaining to someone that it wouldn't be for long, that things would change soon, that he won't last. Who talks like that about someone they love? A deception, it came right after, like cold rain after the fire of anger. And in a way, it hurt even more. Because anger screams, but disappointment silences. I felt as if something inside me had broken, as if that invisible bond between father and daughter had been cracked from within. I always believed that if I ever got sick, she would be one of the first people to hold my hand, to support me, to defend my interests. Instead, I was there, sitting alone in the room, wondering if my own daughter was just waiting. What are you waiting for? Waiting for time to do the dirty work? Waiting for life to take its course? Or are you waiting for the perfect opportunity? That's when another feeling began to grow, the feeling of danger. It wasn't just sadness. It wasn't just emotional drama. It was a warning, an almost animal instinct. Something inside me screamed that I needed to open my eyes, that this wasn't an innocent comment, that there was something behind it, something bigger, something that could, in some way, directly affect my future, my assets, the security of everything I had built. I started remembering small, recent details. Her comments about my health, which previously seemed like concern, now sounded like monitoring. Questions about documents, about what was in my name, about insurance, about the will I had made years ago, almost out of obligation. A sudden curiosity to know how things would turn out if something happened to me. At the time, I had interpreted everything as a daughter's concern. Today, sitting there, with that phrase echoing in my head, everything took on a different tone, a different meaning. It was as if I were watching a puzzle come together before my eyes, only the final image wasn't pretty, it was bleak. That's when a suspicion began to form within me, slowly but surely. Could this be about money? I'm not rich, I never have been, but I'm not destitute either. After decades of work, I managed to build a house, have some savings, maybe a plot of land, some investments set aside. Nothing that would impress on television, but enough to guarantee a decent life. And in the end, we know, when there's some wealth involved, people change. Sometimes even those we least expect. I started thinking about my will. It had been years since I'd signed those papers, almost without paying attention, just wanting to get the paperwork over with quickly. At the time, I'd divided everything simply and fairly, like any father would. But today, with that phrase hammering in my mind, I wondered, does she already know everything that's in my will? Could someone have been showing her things, commenting on them, suggesting things to her? Could it be that, in her mind, I'm no longer a father, but a stepping stone to a more comfortable financial future? It's painful even to put these kinds of thoughts into words. No father wants to look at his son and see self-interest. No father wants to believe that the love he gave might have been mixed with calculation, convenience, or the expectation of inheritance. But that night, I could no longer escape these questions. Every recent gesture of my daughter now seemed to have a double meaning. Each, "How are you feeling, Dad?" sounded like an inspection. Each, "You should rest more," seemed like a reminder of fragility. Every distant glance, every whispered phone call, it all seemed to be part of a silent game I didn't know I was playing. And it was in this whirlwind of emotions, burning anger, chilling fear, crushing disappointment, danger sounding the alarm within me, that decision began to take shape. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't impulsive. It was born first as a timid, almost embarrassed thought, but it grew stronger. I need to protect myself, because in the end, as much as I loved my daughter, I also needed to love myself. I needed to ensure that if there was indeed a financial interest involved, at least it wouldn't be so easy to turn me into someone disposable. And the only way to do that would be by addressing precisely where, perhaps, everything was focused. My will. That night, even before picking up the phone to call the lawyer, even before confronting my daughter, one truth was already clear to me. The phrase I had heard might have been misinterpreted. It might not even have been about me. But the simple fact that I could believe it already said a lot about the distance that had grown between us, and about the risk I was running if I continued to ignore the signs. And with a heavy heart, I accepted something no father wants to admit. When love mixes with fear and suspicion, home ceases to be a safe place. And from that point on, I no longer saw myself only as a father. I saw myself as someone who desperately needed to protect myself from the very people I least imagined I would one day fear. When I talk about what I've built throughout my life, I'm not just talking about material possessions. I'm talking about decades of sweat, sleepless nights, calloused hands, tight budgets, and difficult choices. My wealth wasn't born from luck. It was born from effort, sacrifice, and an almost stubborn persistence. And perhaps that's exactly why it hurts so much to imagine that someone might look at all this not as the fruit of dedication, but as an opportunity, as a prize, as an inheritance to be awaited or anticipated. My house, for example, it's not a mansion, far from it. It's a simple but welcoming house, built little by little, almost like the story of a life planted brick by brick. I remember the first walls being raised. At the time, I was still working 2 jobs and didn't have the money to hire someone to build everything ready-made. So, what I could, I did with my own hands. I laid flooring, painted, fixed the plumbing. Each year I improved a little bit. Whoever enters it today might not realize it, but I know exactly where each effort is. Every corner of that house carries my story. Besides that, I have some savings. Nothing extraordinary, but enough to give me peace of mind. I worked hard to build up savings that would allow me to grow old with dignity, without having to depend on anyone. I saved every penny, always thinking about my children's future, believing that by doing so, I was building a solid foundation for them. I never imagined that this same foundation could one day be interpreted as an obstacle between someone's patience and the money that would come after my departure. Throughout my life, I also managed to buy 2 small plots of land. Simple plots, in areas that nobody valued at the time. I bought them because they were cheap, because it was money I had saved with sacrifice, and because I always heard that land doesn't depreciate. And indeed, over time, the land appreciated in value. Today it's worth more than it was when I bought it. Nothing that will make me a millionaire, but enough to spark the interest of those who see numbers before they see people. And then there's my business. Small, yes, but mine. An undertaking that I started almost as a dream and maintained with discipline. There were good days and bad days, months of profit and months of loss. There were nights when I thought about giving up, when I wondered if it was all worth it. But I continued, partly out of pride, partly out of necessity, partly because I wanted to leave something solid for my family. And if it weren't for any of that, I would continue just to prove to myself that I could, indeed, build something that would last. What I have today is the result of a lifetime. Nothing was inherited. Nothing came easy. No door was opened for me without me knocking on it first, and sometimes having to force it open with determination. I carry this as a personal honor, as a symbol of who I am. Every time I think about my wealth, I don't see numbers. I see stories. I see achievements. I see sacrifices that no one saw, tears that no one noticed, and victories that only I know how much they cost. And perhaps that's why it's so painful to imagine that someone, especially someone from my own family, could look at all this without feeling anything, without seeing the sleepless nights I spent, without valuing the emotional weight that each brick, each penny, each document carries. Because wealth isn't just possession, it's an extension of life, physical proof of a journey. The most difficult thing, however, is realizing that the people around us may see this heritage in a different light, not as a memory, but as a future, not as a sacrifice, but as a financial opportunity, not as history, but as a resource. And when love mixes with this kind of self-interest, everything becomes dangerous. I know exactly what I have, and I know exactly how much it cost. But the emotional value of my wealth also makes it vulnerable, because anyone who knows my story knows that everything I built was with my children's well-being in mind, and that unfortunately is something that can be easily distorted by those who see an advantage. Sometimes I think about what my hands had to endure so that I could have some stability today. I remember the long hours in the heat of construction, the smell of grease when I worked in the workshop, the tiring trips when I made deliveries, the cuts, the bruises, the exhaustion. All of that brought me to where I am today. But none of that serves as a shield when someone you love starts to see you as an obstacle between the present and a future they might think they deserve sooner. And that's why, for me, heritage matters. Not just for its financial value, but for what it represents. It's living proof of my effort, my identity, my struggle. And when I heard my daughter say, "He won't last long," suddenly all of that wealth, everything that has built who I am, seemed to be at risk, not only because it could be taken away, but because it could be shaping intentions I never imagined I would face. And perhaps the worst pain of all is realizing that, after a lifetime of honest work, what you proudly built can become the reason you feel threatened within your own home. My wealth exists because I fought for it, but now it has become a cruel reminder. What we leave behind for our children may be precisely what puts us in danger when we grow old. When someone you love utters a phrase that cuts deeper than any knife, there's a second, just one, when your mind goes completely blank. It's as if everything around you disappears. The noise of the house, the clock ticking, the objects around you, even your breathing seems to stop. That's exactly how it was for me. After hearing the phrase, "He won't last long," I stood there frozen, trying to understand if it had really happened. But the truth came quickly, crushing any denial I was still trying to create. I needed to get out of there. I needed to breathe. I needed to think without the weight of that house crushing me. I left slowly, almost silently, as if fleeing from an invisible danger, and in a way, that's exactly what it was. Each step I took towards the door felt like carrying tons on my shoulders. When I finally stepped outside, I felt the air hit my face like a blow. Night was beginning. The sky had that orange hue that should convey peace, but to me it only brought the feeling that something had turned upside down. The first deep breath I managed to release came out shaky, forced. It didn't feel natural. My whole body was tense, as if I were preparing for a real threat. And it was strange, profoundly strange, to realize that the threat was coming from inside my own home, from my own daughter. I walked to the gate like someone walking after delivering devastating news, and perhaps that was exactly it. My mind was at war with itself. One side kept repeating, "You misunderstood. She wasn't talking about you. Don't be unfair." The other side retorted brutally, "What if he was talking? What if that phrase was just a piece of something much bigger? What if you're taking a risk?" This conflict began to create within me a feeling I didn't remember feeling since my most difficult youthful days: paranoia. But it wasn't a paranoia that arose from nowhere. It was fueled by everything I had seen and heard in recent months. The coldness, the distance, the connections, the calculated posture. I was trying to rationalize, trying to be fair, trying not to turn into a man who distrusted his own daughter. But something inside me, something as deep as it was primal, screamed that I couldn't ignore that warning. I needed to protect myself. When I realized this, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was like admitting an emotional defeat, like acknowledging that something within such an important relationship had broken. But at the same time, it was a natural instinct, an almost physical need. My whole life I had protected my daughter, and now, for the first time, I needed to protect myself, even if it was from her. I looked at the street, trying to calm myself. A car passed slowly. Some people walked in the distance. The world went on as normal. And there I was, standing, my heart racing and my mind spinning like a whirlwind. That's when I understood that I couldn't handle everything alone. I needed someone who was emotionally detached from the situation, someone who could guide me clearly, someone who understood the weight of phrases like that. I needed a lawyer. It wasn't about accusing my daughter. It wasn't about punishing her. It was about prevention, about safety, about setting limits before it was too late. My will was outdated, written at a time when I never imagined that trust could turn into fragility. And if there was any possibility, however small, that that phrase had anything to do with the future of my assets, then I could no longer ignore the gravity of it. I picked up my cell phone with trembling hands and looked for my lawyer's number, the same one who helped me open my small business years ago. He was always straightforward, honest, someone I trusted, the kind of person who doesn't sugarcoat reality, even if it hurts. The clock was almost 7 in the evening, but I needed to try, and I tried. When I called, he answered with a surprised but not angry voice. "Is everything all right?" he asked. I hesitated. The word yes wouldn't come out. The truth was, everything wasn't all right. Not at all. "I need to talk to you today," I replied, my voice so heavy that he was silent for a few seconds before saying, "Come in, I'm in the office." I hung up without being able to properly thank them. My chest was tight, and each step toward the car seemed to confirm within me that this was the right path, and at the same time the most painful one I had walked in a long time. When I got into the car, I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My expression wasn't that of a normal man returning home after a day's work. It was the expression of someone finally accepting a truth he didn't want to see. I was afraid. Not afraid of violence, not physically afraid, but afraid of the intention. Afraid of the possibility that someone I love was counting the days. Afraid of the idea that my possessions, my achievements, my life could be seen as obstacles. Paranoia grew inside me like a shadow, but at the same time something bigger was growing too. Self-preservation. And it's curious how the survival instinct takes over when you least expect it. It doesn't matter who's involved. It doesn't matter how much love you feel. At some point, if you perceive a risk, even an emotional one, your body acts in self-defense. And that night, my body and mind were aligned in a single certainty. I needed to act. I started the car, took a deep breath, and drove to the lawyer's office. The whole way was silent. No music, no clear thoughts. Just that phrase repeating in my head like a whispered threat. He won't last long. Driving in those conditions was like driving through fog. I could see the street, but I couldn't really see. I was present, but at the same time distant, buried in the feeling of having lost control of my own life. When I parked in front of the office, I stood still in the car for a few minutes, breathing deeply, trying to find the strength to take the next step. Opening that door would be more than just seeking help. It would be admitting that I no longer fully trusted my daughter. It would be accepting that the bond I thought was unbreakable had been shattered. It would be the beginning of a change that would likely be irreversible. But I did. I got out of the car, closed the door, walked to the office, rang the doorbell, and when the door opened, I realized that this would be the night I would make one of the most difficult and most necessary decisions of my life. My lawyer's office always had something welcoming about it. Maybe it was the smell of coffee mixed with the aroma of old wood, or maybe it was the calm silence, the kind that leaves room to think, breathe, reorganize the inner chaos. But that night, when I crossed the glass door and entered, the atmosphere seemed completely different. The walls that once conveyed security now seemed to tighten, as if they held too many secrets, too many truths, too many questions. and I was just another man entering there, carrying an invisible weight on my shoulders. My lawyer, Dr. Henrique, looked up as soon as he saw me. He was one of those men who speak little but observe a great deal. Tall, with gray hair, his gaze always attentive. Not the gaze of someone judging, but of someone who reads situations like one reads contracts, line by line, between the lines, intentions. "Come in," he said, opening the door to the private room. "It looks serious." I sat down slowly in the leather chair, my body too stiff, as if any movement could cause the truth to overflow. He noticed. He always noticed. He put his coffee cup aside, crossed his hands, and waited. He gave me time. He didn't rush me. He just let the silence fill the room until I could finally take a deep breath and begin. And I began by telling him everything. The phrase, the tone, the context, the coldness, the distance of the last few months, the mysterious phone calls, the growing feeling that something was wrong. I left nothing out. While I spoke, he didn't interrupt. He just observed, like a doctor who listens attentively to a patient before giving a difficult diagnosis. When I finished, he remained silent for long seconds. So long that it made me rethink everything I had said. Maybe I was exaggerating. Maybe I was tired, sensitive, too emotional. Maybe, but before I could doubt myself, he spoke. "Let's take it easy." His voice was firm, neutral, balanced, as always. "That phrase you heard, it could mean many things, or it could mean nothing at all, but the context, that's what needs to be analyzed." I felt my stomach clench. He adjusted his glasses and continued. "First, I need to know one thing. Is there any history of manipulation?" The question came like a silent punch. I was surprised. I had never thought of my daughter with that word. Manipulation? That was too harsh. But at the same time, that conversation opened a door in my mind, a door I had been avoiding for months. "Not that I know of," I replied hesitantly. "But lately she's been different, asking me about documents, about how my finances are going, things she never showed interest in before." He wrote something down in a notebook. "Okay. Second question, does she have debts?" This one hurt even more. I always thought I knew my daughter, her habits, her fears, her limits. But the truth is, her world was no longer the same as the one I saw when she was a child. She had her own life, with her own problems, her own choices, and perhaps, just perhaps, financial pressure that I wasn't aware of. "I have no idea," I admitted. "He never told me anything, but I never asked either." Henrique nodded, as if he had already expected that answer. "And the third question," he said, leaning forward, "is she under someone's influence?" That question hit me the hardest, because I had already thought about it, even without wanting to admit it. Those mysterious calls, the way she whispered, her cold tone of voice, nothing seemed to come solely from her. It seemed coordinated, as if someone were guiding her, pressuring her, whispering words in her ear. "I don't know," I replied, feeling my throat go dry. "But I have this feeling, like she's being guided." The lawyer took a deep breath. "This changes a lot." He closed the notebook, placed his hands on the table, and looked me directly in the eyes. "Listen carefully. When someone says he won't last long, that phrase can carry a universe of interpretations. It could be about health. It could be about a relationship. It could be about a project, about an opportunity, or it could be about you." My breath caught in my throat. "The point is that, in the context you described, sudden distance, hushed conversations, questions about possessions, calculated tone, that phrase could mean much more than it seems." A shiver ran through my body. Henrique continued. "Parents often trust their children too much, and I understand that. But my role here isn't emotional, it's legal, and legally speaking, you've described a worrying scenario. Not enough for charges, but enough for preventative measures." I lowered my gaze, feeling the weight of reality. He then paused for a long time, as if carefully choosing his words. "You need to understand that there are 3 possibilities. Your daughter wasn't talking about you, and you're living through a painful misunderstanding. She was talking about you, but without malice, perhaps concerned about your health, perhaps misinterpreting something. She was talking about you intentionally, whether intentionally or under the influence of someone else. My chest tightened even more. He continued, "And there is a fourth possibility, the most dangerous of all." I looked up. His voice lowered, making the atmosphere even heavier. "You may not be safe." My heart raced. "I'm not talking about physical violence," he clarified quickly, "but about something emotional, psychological, financial. The mere expectation of inheritance can push some people to behaviors you would never imagine." I felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. "Therefore, my advice is simple and important. Take preventative measures immediately." He took a deep breath. "It's not about accusing your daughter. It's about ensuring that, should there be any risk, whether of emotional manipulation, external pressure, or financial interest, you are protected." That word echoed again within me. Protected. And for the first time that night, I realized that everything I thought was safe, my house, my land, my savings, even my business, now seemed vulnerable. The lawyer then concluded, "The phrase you heard might just be the tip of the iceberg. It could be much deeper than you imagine. And, in your shoes, I wouldn't." Ignore that. The silence that settled in the room after that sentence was heavy, denso, unbreathable. But deep down, I already knew. From that point on, there was no turning back. When the lawyer finished speaking, I felt an abyss open before me. On one side, the father. On the other, the man who needed to protect himself. And for the first time in my life, these two sides didn't seem to be walking in the same direction. Being a father had always meant giving, offering, yielding, enduring, but now, being a father also meant, in some harsh and bitter way, defending oneself. Henrique pulled out a folder of documents, opened the drawer, and took out a copy of my old will. I recognized the cover immediately. It had been so many years since I had signed it that it almost seemed like an artifact from another life. At the time, my wife and I were still together, full of plans, believing that our children would always be a reflection of our efforts. I never imagined, not for a second, that one day I would be sitting there, reevaluating every line because of a phrase spoken in the hallway of my own house. "Let's review what you've established," he said, his voice sober. As he read, I felt a mixture of pride and anguish. I had generously divided everything. The house, the land, the savings, the business, everything planned so that my children wouldn't have to fight over anything, so that there would be no arguments, so that the memory of my departure wouldn't be marked by conflict. At that moment, however, the question echoing inside me was different. Had I been naive? "As it stands now," the lawyer explained, "your daughter is the primary heir to a larger portion of the assets. This was decided at a time when you believed she would assume more responsibilities, right?" I nodded silently. She was the most organized, the one I thought would take care of everything, the one who seemed to have the most common sense. I saw her as a pillar of the family. Seeing that role crumble hurt more than any change of contract signed there. "Do you want to keep things as they are?" Henrique asked, looking directly into my eyes. The question hung in the room. It was simple, and yet it wasn't. I didn't want to be unfair. I didn't want to act impulsively. I didn't want to punish my daughter without being absolutely certain of anything. But I also couldn't ignore what I had heard, what I had perceived, what my own instinct had been screaming day after day. I remained silent. For a few seconds, feeling each memory of our relationship parade through my mind like a strange film. Her as a little girl, running around the house. Her growing up, calling me my hero. Her grown-up, cold, murmuring on the phone. "He won't last long." When I finally managed to speak, the words came out heavy but firm. "I want to change." Henrique nodded as if he had been expecting that answer. "Okay, let's look at the possibilities." He began to calmly explain the legal options I had. I could reduce her share. I could equalize everything. I could include clauses. I could transfer part of the assets while still alive with protection. I could create conditions, and that word resonated strongly. Conditions. He suggested that I remove my daughter from the position of primary heir and reorganize the will in a more balanced way. But he went further. He recommended that I include specific clauses guaranteeing that certain assets could only be accessed under certain circumstances. For example, after a certain period of time, under legal supervision, or destined for specific purposes, such as health, education, or home maintenance. You are not disinheriting your daughter, he emphasized. You are simply protecting yourself and your own assets from misuse or unnecessary pressure. Even so, each word sounded like a kind of internal betrayal. I felt as if I were signing a declaration of distrust. And deep down, that's exactly what it was. I was declaring in writing that I no longer trusted 100% the person I once held in my lap with such pride. As he typed the new document, the sound of the keyboard filled the room like a hammer pounding on my conscience. I wanted to cry, but I didn't. Old men cry too, but sometimes not in front of witnesses. Inside, however, I was falling apart. He adjusted percentages, included other beneficiaries, and distributed assets differently. He suggested that the business be placed under the guardianship of another trusted person, perhaps a nephew, perhaps an administrator, since my daughter had never shown interest in running it and, according to him, could simply sell it without a second thought. You can include a temporary inalienability clause, he explained. That is, some assets cannot be sold immediately. This prevents impulsive decisions and protects the value of the assets. I nodded, even though I felt a knot in my chest. Little by little, everything that had always been so natural to me, giving, trusting, surrendering, was being replaced by a cold, protective mechanism. I felt the moral tension exploding inside me. Am I being unfair? I asked, in a rare moment of explicit vulnerability. Henrique looked at me seriously. It would be unfair not to protect yourself knowing the signs you described, he replied. You're not taking everything away from her. You're just preventing it from turning against you if there is indeed any ulterior motive. Those words gave me a little bit of solid ground to stand on. A little bit. But they didn't erase the guilt. When the document was ready, he turned the screen towards me so I could read it. And there it was. A new version of my last will and testament. A few lines redefining the entire course of my family's future. My daughter no longer appeared as the main heir. She was still there, yes. She would still receive her rightful share, but now with conditions, with limits, with protections. I followed line by line, feeling the weight of each paragraph. It was as if each sentence silently said, "You don't trust completely anymore." When I reached the end, Enrique asked, "Do you agree?" It took me a few seconds to answer, not because I had doubts about the content, but because I knew that by saying yes, I would be crossing a line of no return. "Yes," I finally replied. He printed the papers. The sound of the printer seemed like an official announcement that nothing would be the same again. He placed everything before me, pointed out the places to sign, called the witnesses. I felt my hand grow heavy as I held the pen. It was the same hand that once held hers to cross the street, the same hand that held the steering wheel in the early morning, picking her up from parties so she wouldn't have to go home alone, the same hand that signed registrations, checks, authorizations. Now that hand would sign the biggest protective barrier I've ever built in my life, and ironically against someone from my own family. I signed it. Each signature was an invisible cut. When everything was finished, the document was officially filed and safely stored. Henrique explained the procedures to me, talked about where the copies would be, how to proceed in case of anything. I listened, but a part of me was far away. I felt empty, and at the same time, a little relieved. This was the strangest conflict of all. On one hand, a deep guilt, a feeling that I had failed as a father, because what kind of father feels the need to legally protect himself from his own daughter? On the other hand, a sense of relief, a small pang of peace, knowing that if all this really meant what I feared, at least I wouldn't be caught completely off guard. When I left the office that night, it was as if I had aged 10 years in a few hours. The street seemed the same, but I wasn't. I had gone in there like a father in shock, and I was leaving like a man who had made a tough, cold, necessary decision. The narrative of my life, and my daughter's life, had just taken a turn. And the most painful thing was knowing that she didn't have the slightest idea about it. Yet, I woke up the next day after a practically sleepless night. My body was tired, my mind heavy, my stomach churning. No matter how hard I tried to distract my thoughts, they always came back to the same thing, the phrase, "He won't last long." The new version of the will was already signed. My lawyer had done everything flawlessly, but the emotional weight, that was still there, throbbing inside me like a second heart, aching with every beat. I knew I couldn't continue living in that house with that morbid silence, looking at my daughter and carrying a consuming doubt inside me. I needed to know. I needed to hear the truth from her own mouth, however painful it might be. I decided to confront her. I made coffee, or at least I tried. Automatic movements, as if my hands had learned the routine on their own while my mind wandered far away. The smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen, but it brought no comfort. It only increased the feeling that this house, which was once sacred to me, was now full of lies, hidden noises, invisible shadows. When she came down the stairs, still sleepy, holding her cell phone in her hand as always, my chest tightened. It was her, my girl, my daughter, and at the same time, it was the same person whose words had completely changed the course of my future. "We need to talk," I said. She froze. It was subtle, but I knew every micro-expression of hers. I knew that surprised look, that brief raising of her eyebrows, that half-second when her lips try to form a question but freeze. She knew something was wrong. Maybe she didn't know what, but she felt the weight of it. "What happened, Dad?" she asked, her voice tense. I sat down at the table and motioned for her to sit as well. She obeyed, but uneasily, crossing and uncrossing her fingers, as if preparing herself for some bad news. "Yesterday," I began, taking a deep breath. "I arrived early." She looked up, surprised. "And I heard you talking on the phone." The impact was immediate. She paled, her eyes widened. I don't know if it was guilt, fear, astonishment, or a mixture of all of them, but something had been triggered inside her. "What did you hear?" Her voice trembled. I stared at her for several long seconds before answering. "I heard you say, 'He won't last long.'" Silence. Heavy silence. A silence that screams louder than any words. She stood motionless, staring at me as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. Then he looked away, trying to find an invisible exit in the kitchen wall. "Dad," she began, but immediately fell silent. I left no room for escape. "Were you talking about me?" She closed her eyes for a second. A small gesture, but enough to break my heart. It was the kind of reaction I hadn't expected. It wasn't immediate denial. It wasn't defensiveness. It was pain or regret. "Dad, it's not what you're thinking," she finally said, her voice muffled. "Then tell me what I should think," I replied, more firmly than I intended. She ran her hands over her face, took a deep breath, and for the first time in weeks, truly looked at me. Not that quick, superficial glance, but a deep look, full of something I couldn't decipher. "I was talking about him," she said slowly. "About Lucas." The name fell into the air like a stone. "Lucas who?" I asked, confused. My boyfriend. Boyfriend. I felt a different kind of shock this time. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was surprise. A name I'd never heard before. A relationship she'd never mentioned. A whole life unfolding around me, and there I was, thinking I knew her. "He won't last long with me," she continued more calmly. "I was talking about the relationship. He doesn't make an effort. He doesn't listen to me. He doesn't value anything. I was venting to Camilla saying that he probably wouldn't last long in my life, not you." For a moment, everything around me stood still, as if time had been interrupted just so I could understand. The phrase, the intonation, the mystery, everything fit together in a completely different way than I had imagined. She wasn't talking about me. She was talking about a relationship, a failed relationship, a boyfriend I didn't even know existed, a rant, not about my life, but about hers. I felt my body gradually relax, as if a current had been released. The air finally returned to my lungs. Part of me wanted to laugh with relief. Another part wanted to cry with shame. "Dad, I would never talk about your life like that," she continued, her eyes welling up with tears. I may be distant, I may be confused, I may be making a lot of mistakes, but wanting you dead? Never. She reached her hand across the table hesitantly, as if afraid that the gesture might not be well received. I looked at that hand, and for the first time in a long time, realized how small it seemed, as if it were the hand of the little girl I once held while teaching her to cross the street. As if all of that, distance, coldness, whispered calls, was just a reflection of a difficult phase, not a conspiracy. She took a deep breath and added, I was hiding it, but because I was ashamed. I didn't want you to know I was in a bad relationship. I didn't want to worry you. I didn't want you to think I was making the wrong choices. And then, in an emotional twist I didn't expect, she started to cry. She cried like someone finally letting go of a burden they were carrying. She cried like someone who feels exposed, but also relieved. I watched her for a few seconds before standing up and going to her. I placed my hand on her shoulder slowly, feeling my own heart break inside. I had distrusted my own daughter. I had let fear erode my confidence. I had imagined terrible scenarios, and because of that, I had formally changed the course of her future. The dramatic twist wasn't just in what she revealed. It was based on what I realized about myself. I was afraid of losing my assets. But, without realizing it, I almost missed something much bigger, my relationship with my daughter. She was crying. I took a deep breath, and the silence that had previously been one of distrust was now one of reconciliation. And even though I was relieved, I knew that this story wasn't over yet, because the truth had come to light. But the consequences of the fear I felt still echoed within me. I am not a man who considers himself weak. I've lived through too much for that. I've gone hungry. I've endured humiliation. I've worked until my body gave out. But there, standing beside my daughter, watching her cry with her face in her hands, I realized there was a kind of pain for which no one prepares you. The pain of realizing you've wronged someone you love terribly, out of fear. I'm sorry, was the first thing I managed to say. She lifted her face, her eyes red, her nose slightly swollen. She still held her cell phone, as if it were a kind of protection, a fragile shield that had become irrelevant after that conversation. Excuse me? She repeated, as if she hadn't expected to hear that from me. Yes, I replied, sitting back down at the table, but this time closer to her. I thought the worst. I thought you were talking about me, that you were hoping I would die. The words came out with difficulty. Just pronouncing them made my chest feel like it was tightening inside. Her eyes widened, shocked, hurt, almost indignant. Dad, how could you think that of me? It wasn't an aggressive question. It was a lament. I took a deep breath. Because I was afraid, I admitted. Afraid of dying, afraid of being left behind, afraid that everything I built would just become a number on someone's account, afraid of being treated like a burden. And when I heard that phrase, the way you said it, I shook my head. My heart went straight to the worst-case scenario. She remained, silent for a few seconds, taking a deep breath, processing. Then she spoke, her voice still trembling but firmer. I was scared too, Dad. That sentence caught me by surprise. Afraid of what? I asked. She glanced at the table, absent-mindedly spinning the empty cup in her hands. Fear of disappointing you. Fear of you looking at me and thinking I ruined my life. Fear of hearing, I told you so. He paused, swallowed hard. I've been in a bad relationship for months, Dad. He treats me badly, ignores me, disappears, comes back whenever he wants. I know I should have ended it a long time ago, but I got stuck on the idea that things could get better, stuck on the fear of being alone, stuck on the shame of admitting that I put up with so much wrongdoing. She began to speak as if a dam had opened inside her. I started distancing myself from you because I knew that if you noticed, you would call me to talk. You would insist that I get out of it. You would say that I deserved better, and I knew you would be right. But I wasn't ready to face the truth, so I ran away. I disconnected. I hid in my own broken relationship. She laughed humorlessly. What you perceived as coldness was actually a way for me not to fall apart in front of you. That hit me hard. Instead of a calculating villain, as my fears had painted her, I now saw a lost, wounded woman, trying to stay on her feet in the wrong way. My daughter wasn't plotting against me. She was trying to survive her own choices. And the money? I asked carefully. The questions about assets, wills, documents? She sighed. I asked because Lucas is full of opinions about everything, she began, with a look that was a mixture of anger and shame. He always says that old people don't know how to handle money, that people of your generation don't think about planning, things like that. He kept asking me how I had organized my will, if I had insurance, if I had any plans. I said I didn't know, and he said it was irresponsible of the family not to think about it. She paused. Part of me wanted to believe he was worried about you, but thinking about it, I think he was worried about something else. My stomach sank. The lawyer was right. Someone could be influencing her. And even if she couldn't see it clearly, the danger was there, lurking, entering through the door uninvited. He never said anything, so directly, about inheritance? I asked, choosing my words carefully. She hesitated for a moment before answering. He did say that, she confessed. Once, after a few drinks, he commented that if you were smarter, you would have already organized everything so there wouldn't be a mess when you left. I felt uncomfortable right away. I changed the subject, but he brought it up again several times, as if it were just a rational conversation. I didn't get it, or I didn't want to get it. She looked up at me with genuine guilt etched on her face. I never wished for your death, Dad, never. But I allowed someone to get close to our lives with a dangerous look. And for that, I also feel guilty. My chest ached in a new way. It was no longer the weight of distrust. It was the weight of empathy. I saw before me not an enemy, but a daughter who was as lost as I was, only in a different kind of fear. I took a deep breath, and for the first time, decided to open up to her about a part of myself that I had always kept hidden. Do you know what the biggest fear of an aging man is? I asked. She shook her head, wiping away her tears. It's not death itself, I replied. It's how they'll look at him before that. She stared at me intently. When you're young, you're seen as the future. When you get old, many people start to see you as the end, as a limit, as an obstacle. The fear I felt when I heard that phrase, it wasn't just the fear of dying. It was the fear of discovering that, to the people I love most, I was just an old man passing through. Tears welled up in her eyes again. Good. And there's more, I continued. I'm also afraid of being betrayed. And I'm not talking about romantic betrayal. I'm talking about betrayal of trust, of looking into the face of someone I helped grow, someone I loved, and realizing that person values my things more than my presence. That's the kind of fear that corrodes from the inside out. She took a deep breath, crying silently. I never wanted you to feel this way, he murmured. No, I didn't mean to, I replied, but I felt it. That was the point where the conversation stopped being accusations from one side and defenses from the other and became something bigger, an encounter. Two human beings, hurt, vulnerable, trying to understand each other. She began telling me things she had been keeping to herself for months. Anxiety attacks, the feeling of failure for being trapped in a bad relationship, debts she took on to help her boyfriend that he never paid, toxic, comments she swallowed in silence. I listened to everything in silence with a heavy heart, realizing that while I feared being abandoned, she feared being too alone to ask for help. I should have told you sooner, she said, but I'm afraid of your judgment. I let out a sad laugh. And I'm afraid of losing you, I replied. Look at the irony. A different kind of silence settled in. It was no longer the silence of accusation. It was the silence of reflection, the kind of pause where people truly listen to each other. I changed my will yesterday, I confessed, my voice breaking. Before speaking to you, I went to the lawyer, changed everything. I put in place protections. I removed you as the primary heir. She looked at me, surprised, hurt, but, curiously, she didn't react with immediate anger. I think that, after everything we talked about, she was already expecting some reaction from me. You thought I was a risk, she said, without raising her voice. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. I thought I might be too naive, I replied honestly. And as we get older, naivete comes at a high price. I didn't do it because I hate you. I did it because I was afraid. And fear, when not discussed, becomes a silent decision. She stared at me for a few seconds. Then she took a deep breath. If you think you need that to feel safe, I understand, she said. I don't like it. It hurts. But I understand. At that moment, the emotional connection between us didn't come from a perfect, beautiful, ideal place. It came from reality, from a place full of flaws, fears, misinterpretations, but also a desire to get it right, to try to rebuild. I extended my hand, and this time she took it without hesitation. I was wrong about you, I said. I also made mistakes with you, she replied. And perhaps that's what connects people most deeply. Not the fantasy of a relationship without cracks, but the courage to sit at the table, look at the shards and say, okay, let's see what else we can glue together. At that moment, I understood that while I had protected my assets, I had almost lost something far more precious, the truth between us. And the audience listening to this story might see themselves in both of us, in the father who fears being discarded and in the daughter who fears disappointing. Because in the end, the greatest legacy one can leave behind is not the house, nor the land, nor the savings. It's the certainty that, despite the mistakes, we had the courage to look each other in the eye and tell the truth. After that long, painful, and enlightening conversation with my daughter, the house felt different. Not because anything physical had changed, but because the air was different. Lighter, more honest, more real. For so many months, we lived surrounded by misinterpreted silences, confused gestures, and fears that neither of us had the courage to verbalize. And now, after finally letting it all out, it felt like the weight we had been carrying had been lifted from our shoulders all at once. I sat in the living room that night, looking at the armchair where, days before, I had felt my world crumble upon hearing that cold, unsettling phrase. And I realized that that same place now witnessed a completely different story. It was no longer a scene of fear. It was the starting point of an unexpected reconciliation. My daughter entered the room after some time, her face still marked by the conversation we had, but with a much more serene look. She sat beside me, saying nothing for a few seconds. And in that silence, I felt that something inside us was being rebuilt. Not in a quick way, like someone hastily gluing something broken back together, but in a careful, respectful, conscious way. Dad, do you think you'll ever trust me again the same way? She asked softly, as if afraid of the answer. I took a deep breath, looked at her, and answered truthfully. Not the ready-made answer someone would give just to avoid conflict, but the truth that stemmed from the maturity and vulnerability of that moment. Trust isn't a door that you just open and close, I said. It's a bridge. Sometimes it gets weak, sometimes it's full of cracks. But if two people want to rebuild, it becomes strong again. And I want to rebuild, she cried again, this time not from pain, but from relief. And I, who had always been too proud to cry in front of my children, let my heart soften. Because at that moment, we weren't a father and daughter fighting. We were two human beings trying to find each other after walking down dark paths for a long time. With the house quiet and my mind calmer, I realized something important about myself. The decisions I made in the midst of fear, like changing my will in a hurry, weren't necessarily wrong decisions, but they were incomplete. They lacked something crucial: dialogue, context, truth. I did it believing I was protecting myself. But after that conversation, I understood that decisions made in the heat of fear carry invisible scars. Not because they are malicious, but because they are born from a place where pain speaks louder than reason. And that's why I decided to review the will again. This time calmly, clearly, and most importantly, with my daughter by my side. Not to give everything away, not to revert to the previous plan as if nothing had happened, but to build a document that reflects the truth of our current relationship, a mix of learning, protection, and growth. The next morning, I called my lawyer. I want to adjust a few things, I told him, not out of fear, but out of conscience. He understood immediately. And, unlike the previous night, I didn't enter the office trembling, anxious, or suspicious. I entered as someone who understood that wealth isn't just money. It's also a reflection of our relationships, our principles, and above all, our capacity to forgive and start over. The new version of the will is fairer, more balanced, more secure, yes, but also more humane. My daughter remained a legitimate heir, but now with a clear understanding of the responsibilities, the limits, the necessary protections. Not because I feared she would hurt me, but because we both understand that precaution is never excessive when it comes to the future. And when we left the office together, I noticed something I hadn't seen on her face in a long time. Peace. That peace that appears when there are no more masks, no secrets, no half-finished conversations. When father and daughter find each other again after a long time lost in their own pain. We went home in silence. But it was a beautiful silence, the kind of silence that exists when two people know that something important, something big, has been resolved. That night, as I closed the windows and turned off the lights, I thought about everything that had happened, about how a phrase said unintentionally almost destroyed an entire relationship, about how fear can distort reality to the point of transforming love into suspicion, and about how, in the end, the truth, even when it hurts, is always the most liberating path. I sat in the same armchair where it all began and looked around. The house was still the same. My daughter, too. Me, too. But something inside us had changed forever. I thought about how fragile life is, how misunderstandings can silently grow into monsters, how the people we love most are often the ones we hurt the most, and also the ones who hurt us the most. But I also thought about how true love has an impressive capacity to survive the cracks. That's when I formulated the phrase that, in a way, sums up everything I've experienced. Sometimes, fear can even turn love into suspicion, and the truth, even when painful, is liberating. And that is perhaps the greatest lesson I can leave behind. Don't let silence destroy what love has built. Don't let fear speak louder than dialogue. Don't let assumptions take the place of truth, because in the end, we don't lose each other because of mistakes. We lose ourselves because of what we fail to say. And that night, for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was finally true. If this story has captivated you this far, leave a like and subscribe. It helps me bring you more profound stories like this one. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if you heard someone in your own family say, "He won't last much longer"?